Welcome to Let's Hear It.
Let's Hear It is a podcast for and about the field of foundation and nonprofit communications, produced by its two co-hosts, Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. No relation.
Well said, Eric. And I'm Kirk.
And I'm Eric.
The podcast is sponsored by the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
We're talking to people about their work and what's happening in the field with the hopes of making this growing arena just a little bit more accessible to us all.
You can find Let's Hear It on any podcast subscription platform. You can find us on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast, and you can email us at hello@letshearitcast.com.
Let us know if you have any thoughts about what you hear today, including people we should have on the show.
And if you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find us.
So let's get on to the show. Welcome to Let's Hear It. It's fabulous to have you back. And I'm really pleased to announce that Kirk Brown has successfully completed another interview.
That's true.
I'm proud of you, my friend.
Me too.
It's you're showing some chops. It's really great, Kirk. Now I have to tell you that you are high on my list of people who depress me.
Yeah, I try to.
Tell. And let's just discuss that a little bit. Who are we going to listen to today?
Okay, we're headed to Cambridge. We're talking, it's the Bennett Institute for Public Policy.
Which Cambridge?
Cambridge, I don't know. Cambridge.
England?
Yes, Cambridge University in England. In
the real
Grand
Cambridge.
Old England. And
not the Bozers in
no.
Massachusetts.
No. We're getting very highfalutin with this. And
got it.
In October 2020, their Center for the Future of Democracy issued a report entitled Youth in Satisfaction with Democracy. And the findings are worth previewing before we get into the interview, because basically the findings aren't so good. That we're confronting globally a historically low levels of satisfaction with democracy amongst youth, which basically counts as anybody millennial and younger. So we have on the podcast two of the key contributors to that report, Dr. Roberto Foa and his research associate colleague, Daniella Wenger. Were gracious enough to respond to my just out of the blue query, because I'd seen coverage of the work that they had done, and they were willing to spend time with me on the podcast talking about it. So this is Youth in Satisfaction with Democracy, and it's a little bit of a ride. I will say it's a little bit of a ride, because it's really a bummer what they
and
uncovered.
Satisfaction. We will put in extremely large air quotes.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, well, so we will listen to this conversation, and we will be back to talk about it after the conversation.
Welcome today for another edition of Let's Hear It, and I am so pleased and grateful today to be joined by Dr. Roberto Stefan Foa and Danielle Wenger, both from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge. Roberto and Danielle, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Hear It today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
So our topic today is Youth in Satisfaction with Democracy. And Roberto and Daniela, that sounds like a really sunny title. So it sounds like we've got good news to talk about today. Is that correct?
There are elements of good news in the report, and that should certainly not be overlooked. However, I suppose the headline findings are a little bit more pessimistic. And the key finding, I suppose, is that young people across the world, including in the United States, and perhaps especially in the United States, are more dissatisfied with democracy in the past and much more dissatisfied.
And I think one of the things I saw from your assessment, how that dissatisfaction gets expressed, and it seems like one measure, at least, is the extent to which young people choose to participate in politics. Is that fair as well?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that for a long period of time, people have argued that, well, maybe it's not so bad that young people are dissatisfied with democracy, because maybe that means that young people are just more critical, have higher standards for, people expect of politicians. And, that can express itself in pro-civic ways, right? That could express itself through protest. It could also express itself through political mobilization or voting. And I think part of our argument is to say, well, hold on a second, because that is a possible expression of that discontent. But it's also possible that after a period of time with disillusionment with how institutions are functioning, people can also become withdrawn, can become apathetic, can become distanced from politics, and potentially mobilizable by very toxic anti-system politicians and parties.
Obviously, our audience is global, and our data show that people listen to this podcast around the world. But we have a big following in the United States as well. How would you say the view looks from the United States relative to what the data show from other parts of the world? Do you have a feeling for that? I mean, is the general take about the same, more or less, better or worse? And any perspective specific to the United States from what you saw in the analysis?
I think that the trends that are seen in the United States are also echoed across the world, given also to hear young people are less satisfied with democracy in absolute and relative terms. I think that the findings, which maybe we'll get into a little bit later, about populism and how young people are feeling about populist leaders, or even the backlash against populist rhetoric, is also seen throughout the world. So I think it's really interesting to see how these trends are global, and the U.S. is just one example is yet another example, I should say, of young people's dissatisfaction with democracy.
And so you talk about populism, and I'm just curious, can you first define for me that term, and then also what did you see related to populism and where this dissatisfaction with democracy can go? Because I think that to me struck me as kind of like one of the aha and uh-oh parts of what you were finding here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, populism is one of those terms where, if you ask four academics for a definition, you'll get different responses. Okay, I'll try and keep it to one. Can just be my take. I think populism is defined as anti-system politics. It's someone who comes in, who's an outsider, who says, look, I'm the voice of the people, the system is corrupt, going to drain the swamp, vote for me. The key to the populist as a politician is you mobilize people by channeling their anger, their rage, their frustration at some target group. And, what that target group is kind of defines what kind of populist you are, right? If you're a left-wing populist or a right-wing populist, are you targeting immigrants? Are you targeting the political elite? And I guess all populists target the political elite. Are you targeting economic elites, and the rich or the wealthy, which moves you in a more left-wing direction? The populists kind of have this very simple frame, right? It's a very simple frame in terms of the people versus the elite, and the populist demagogue as, the voice of the people.
Well, and this is what was so striking to me in seeing your analysis come forward, and in a sense, I feel like what your assessment is pointing out was that notion that the younger generation coming behind more deeply gets at their core, it seems, some of these intrinsic values that we've been fighting for so long. Do you have a perspective on that, or can you help me parse that?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think it's important to be hopeful. Hope is not a strategy. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst is probably a good motto in life. I think that, starting with Generation X, but much more so with millennials, I think that the life experience for democracy has been very different. I mean, if you think about the United States, you've had multiple elections where the winning candidate has not actually got a majority of the vote. You have the war in Iraq, and I guess in some sense, I don't know if I would say humiliation, but certainly exhaustion of military engagements overseas. And so that has kind of worn on people's pride in the system, in the country, but also, I guess, in how the system is operating. At the same time, you've got a generation that has come of age that has very serious challenges, right, in one's own life with respect to burdens of student debt in terms of finding housing, especially after the financial crisis. And you look at the political system, and what you see is, a great deal of lobbying. You see gridlock frequently between branches of government, and perhaps a sense that the political system is not delivering for you personally. And you wonder, well, who is it delivering for?
Roberto, you gave me a really important thing to reflect on. And that may be something that I need to put into some of my strategic plan thinking moving forward, that hope isn't the strategy. Do you have any take about our current political landscape in the United States and how it kind of reflects what you found here in the study, or just even how, what we're seeing playing out in the past few weeks and what's ahead here in the next couple of months, how that might influence or inform these trend lines as they move forward? Any thoughts about that?
My first thought is what we're coming from. So Donald Trump is seen as, not just in my perspective, but also from many academics, journalists, and policymakers around the world, as a populist. And in fact, based on our research, he was the only right-wing populist where young people's satisfaction with democracy declined precipitously, as opposed to the other countries where there were right-wing populists where actually young people did gravitate towards their message. But that's more of a tangent that we could talk about a little bit later. In terms of forward-looking things in the United States, I think that Biden is definitely seen among progressives, at least, as a very moderate politician. And I think we did do some data work about how moderates compare to populists in terms of satisfaction with democracy. And our key finding there was that when comparing elections of populist leaders to elections of moderates, we find that when the moderates win, as opposed to the populist incumbent, young people's satisfaction with democracy does not increase and actually, on average, declines over time. Speaking as a millennial American, I want my fellow peers to be re-engaged in the political fold. And I saw the impact that Bernie had on young people and his ability to bring them back into the political fold. And I'm really hopeful, although we were reminded before that hope isn't a strategy, that Biden can bring my peers with him as he continues to lead our country for the next 4 years.
This work is titled Youth and Satisfaction with Democracy. I think a democracy is kind of the governance system, but then, underneath that, there are the issues related to income and wealth inequality and the fabric of social and environmental issues that also are related to and oftentimes come from that. I just wonder, are we seeing dissatisfaction with democracy? Are we seeing dissatisfaction with global economic systems that are leaving some people behind while other people race ahead? Does parsing it that way help us in any way or not? Or is it just confusing the issue because democracy is our preferred tool for addressing those economic questions? Any thoughts about that?
One thing that I've got to be really clear about is that the question that we use in our research is asking people about their level of satisfaction with the functioning of democracy. So it's not a measure of people's democratic ideals, people's desire for democracy in some abstract sense. It's, looking at the system you have now, how satisfied are you with how it's working? And that's why I think you can't really separate out the economic from the political. If you think about the causes of millennial discontent, you can look at student debt or the inability to get housing, find decent employment and jobs. And you might say, well, okay, that's discontent with life, but not really discontent with democracy. But at the end of the day, if the roots of that inequality link in the political system, right, in terms of the inability to deliver good healthcare when the public has strong demand for it, or the power of lobbyists and the ways in which there's often a real misalignment between what the public wants to get out of Washington, D.C. and what actually goes on there, then I don't think you can separate those two things.
Well, and I think that note you touched on, though, so this odd thing where the moderate voice doesn't necessarily correlate to greater satisfaction with the functioning of democracy, but that populist voice can. So can you explore that a little bit? If we don't address some of this undercurrent of dissatisfaction, what's ahead actually if we don't really see progress in some of the things that you've pointed out are the causes for the dissatisfaction?
I think a short answer to what lies ahead is just like more one-term presidencies in the United States, which are like hindered or hampered by an opposing party in the Senate and the House, which perhaps can, on the one hand, can look to many Americans as straight political inefficiency and president that can't get anything done. And then on the other hand, other people may look at it as a president like Biden has a history of reaching across the aisle and working with people with vehemently different ideas about what America should look like. So I think essentially boiling it down, it could either lead to a lot of additional dissatisfaction on the moderate side of things, or additional perhaps optimism about the future.
Well, and so hopefully maybe landing us on a hopeful note, I think, Roberto, one thing you mentioned is that this dissatisfaction with functioning a democracy, you don't see as much with systems that are viewed to be less corrupt or less having these kind of inequalities within the system. Are there some examples that you can point to there, and are there some strategies that emerge from those kinds of systems that shine forth in terms of what's being done to help ensure that people feel better about the functioning of the democracies that they're participating in?
Yeah, sure. There's actually two questions there, right? So the first question is, can we point to countries that where the institutions function, people are satisfied with democracy, young people are satisfied with democracy? There are countries like Switzerland or Norway, Finland, the usual suspects. So that's kind of the easy question, but it's a little bit like Francis Fukuyama, I think, wrote this essay called "Getting to Denmark," right? And the idea was like, we all know what a good democracy looks like. We can see how Denmark functions. We go, okay, there's civic participation, there's equality, people turn out to vote. You have a functioning welfare state, it's a prosperous economy. But we actually don't know how to get there. Second question, which is a bit trickier, is like, okay, given where we are, given our starting point, and I think this comes back to the conversation about Biden presidency and what kind of future lies ahead for the United States, is like, given your starting point, you've had this populist shock, how do you get, quote unquote, back to normal? And of course, Biden's whole campaign is about, getting back to normal. When you read the media discussion in the United States, I mean, after the election, there's a lot of doubts about whether we really can get back to normal. So how do you get out of populism, and are there any countries that have done that? And there's very few cases. Either what you see, I mean, the countries where this has happened, like you could say Greece in the 1990s, sometimes you've had a populist party that has been in time, and then it moderates once it's in office. And you see that a lot. I mean, Lula in Brazil ran as a populist, but once he was in office, he really moderated his platform. And so sometimes that happens. And that's one way of kind of getting out of the populist trap. And the other way is that populism brings society to such a phenomenal crisis. The political system collapses, right, like it did in Peru under Fujimori. And at that point, there's a kind of just a process of refoundation that takes place. And I don't think the United States has got there yet.
Well, this is such important work. And of course, people can find you at the Bennett Institute. But I'm curious, Roberto and Danielle, before we leave you today, and thank you so much for taking time to talk with me about your research. Are there any last pieces related to this research, any last items that you want to make sure that our listeners are thinking about as we move forward? Because certainly it seems like there's a lot here to be grappled with, and it's critically important to find some answers to what we're seeing here in the data.
One thing, especially that given that we're both Californians and you're based in San Francisco, and I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area as a proud Cal alumna, I think it's important to tell my fellow Bay Area residents out there that populism doesn't only exist on the left. There's also, and that populism is growing and young people are increasingly attracted to populism on the right as well. And our study found that young people's satisfaction with democracy increases not only with the election of left-wing populist leaders, but also with the election of right-wing populist leaders, especially in non-English speaking democracies. And I think that that's especially alarming today because, I think that us within California or within the Bay Area often think of populism. We think of Bernie. We think as an ideology that is 100% absorbed by young people, and it's progressive and liberal. But I think it's also important for us to understand that populism on the right is also something that's very attractive to young people around the world.
I mean, the fact that's a global phenomenon, right? It's not just the purview of one type of person or another, right?
Of course. I think that the Bay Area is definitely a bubble, and looking beyond it, when we think about concepts of what democracy should look like, what our governance could look like, is really important. Well,
this is such deep work that's needed, and clearly more to come. Roberto, Daniella, thank you so much for your work, this analysis, everything you're doing at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge, and at the Center for the Future of Democracy. Just thank you. Terrific work. We'll keep our eyes out. We'll stay peeled for what's coming next from you, and hopefully we can have you on a future edition of Let's Hear It, and maybe we'll even be pointing at some indicators that we're making progress with some of this. That would be wonderful.
Okay, maybe we'll be able to provide you with some of those indicators. Thank you, Kirk. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're back. You just had a conversation about youth satisfaction with democracy.
Yes.
So let's just start from the beginning, Kirk.
Yeah.
You are well known to the listeners of this podcast as being a denizen in the depths of the dark underbelly of the world. So you're hooked on misinformation and disinformation, and now youth satisfaction, which we just have to read as youth dissatisfaction with democracy.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about your childhood or how whether your parents didn't treat you well, but why was this interesting to you? What was it you were hoping to get out of this conversation?
Well, true or not, our podcast is about foundation and nonprofit communications with an emphasis on social change and making the world a better place.
Thank you for reminding me.
There it is. So
have a nice night, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Can we do that? Can we make the world a better place if democracy isn't working?
Oh, got it.
What do you think?
Thank you.
Can we do it if democracy itself isn't working?
Okay, A, no. But B, given the parlous state of youth engagement with democracy, not only that, now, did I understand this correctly, that in countries that have elected populist leaders have seen a recovery in youth satisfaction in democracy? What are we supposed to learn from that? So if you have populism, that you're more likely to engage youth and to help them have a more satisfying relationship with democracy. Let me just go back and say, what did you perceive to be the definition of populism, and is it possible to have a progressive or positive form of populism that will engage youth in a way that makes things better? Or are we just kind of destined to this really difficult future?
Destined is the key part. This is what I think you and I need to talk about. So a couple things. So first of all, by the way, as always, we have to say thank you to Dr. Foa and Daniella for coming on the podcast. They were so gracious to talk with me about this. I thought Roberto had a great definition for populism. He said populist is the anti-system candidate. So anybody who's opposing the system. And what I loved about, as he got into that, he said the populist rhetoric is half right. Because and it's populism from the left and right, by the way, right? So it's not just one perspective.
It's Bernie and Donnie.
That's right. And I loved it when he said half of the critique is right, which is those populist voices call out these endemic challenges to the system, and they name it as wrong. And that part is right. It's the second part that gets difficult, which is oftentimes the prescription, but also the populist device of naming a culprit in the process. And it's funny because we've actually had some, we had some pollsters that helped us identify the oligarchs as the culprit, right? And then, of course, we have the horrific language we've seen in the U.S. from the right around, who the culprits are for this systemic thing. So this is the thing I would just throw back to you, Eric, is like that notion, that critique of a system failing. To me, that's the most, or the failures of a system. To me, that's the really interesting and meaty part of this for the work that we do and the work that we see our colleagues doing.
Sure. And yet, so it's true. And we hear about systems change all the time. Mm-hmm. And the other question, however, is changing a system seems like this amorphous, whether you want to call it an enemy or a problem or whatever. Systems kind of are these blobby things that don't have a face or a name or anything.
Yeah.
And changing that is really difficult. Identifying, and at the same time, and we're hearing from folks like Anat Shenker-Osorio, who someday I hope to have on the show, who talks about, yes, it is perfectly fine. She's promoting, sort of helping people on the progressive people in the progressive community communicate and build a narrative around what a positive future would look like. And part of that is identifying that there is a problem, naming the perpetrators of the problem, acknowledging that race is central to many of the challenges that we as a democracy are facing. So, so it's okay to find the person or a thing that you're against, naming it, and then engaging with that. But when the thing that you're against is a system, it makes it kind of hard to figure out where to dig your teeth into. So addressing these systemic problems has always felt to me like, nailing Jell-O against the wall.
No, I totally get it. And it's funny because it makes me think about, like, how do you walk into a foundation and say, I want to fund a love campaign, right? Well, we didn't know how to do that until Travian Shorters told us how to do it, until Travian gave us that. But right, this other piece, how do you walk in and say, oh, the whole system's messed up. How do we address that? So before we go there, one of the things they talked about that I loved was this notion that inequality is at the root. And, we've talked about that on this podcast, and it's the connection. It's income inequality leading to wealth inequality that creates this horrible erosion. And, when you go back, one of the other reasons I thought it would be great to have this on the podcast is that there was a global media campaign about this report when it came out in October 2020. You can do a quick Google search, youth and satisfaction with democracy, and you're going to find coverage from outlets all around the world. And one of the common touchstones for the source of this dissatisfaction, we're still suffering the consequences of the 2008 economic collapse. That, and so we think about this, it's like 12 years later, we're seeing the consequences of this global economic malaise that came out, and how it's gnawing at in all parts of the world, not just in the United States, but in all parts of the world. And then surprisingly, there's some places that actually buck that trend. But this gnawing piece around income and wealth inequality. So I thought that was actually interesting in terms of like putting a finger on the pulse of, okay, here's a problem. I feel like we've heard some really interesting stuff on this podcast about those topics too. What do you think about that?
Well, now that you say that, it worries me even more, because now we've parlayed that lag, that 12-year lag of what happened in 2008 with the global pandemic and the complete shakeup of our economy now. So we have seen, I don't know, you see a piece in the paper almost every week about how the millennials are the generation that got screwed the most.
Yes.
Because they've been through the most and are dealing with all these challenges. And it's an existential thing that will always live with folks who live through this moment.
Yeah.
And B, there's just this clear effect on people's income, their ability to earn an income. You started at a certain level, and that sets your base for the rest of your life. You understand things about what the workforce looks like. The workforce is changing. So these are all phenomenal challenges. And the only question that I have is, how do we, I don't know, I don't want to say use it to our advantage, but how do you how do you learn from this in such a way that you can produce a narrative about what the world could be, use it as an opportunity to build upon some kind of shared experience? Clearly, the systems that we put in place that got us to where we are weren't adequate, and it is an opportunity to build for a much better future. So if you are doing that kind of activism, if you are working in communications or trying to build a new narrative about what the future could look like, engaging with young people today who are clearly at odds on politics, they're ambivalent about democracy. Is it an opportunity? Is it an inflection point? I hope so, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah. Not only do we, I think, that was also one of the things I loved about Roberto. One of his comments, hope is not a strategy, was a famous comment he made. I want to be so hopeful.
Damn him.
Hope is an aspiration,
but
that's
strategies. I don't know.
That's right. So this is why I think this is worth talking about, because I think this is I don't think it's a choice. I think we have to do it. And one of the reasons I was so struck by it too is in my own kind of lackadaisical thinking, I've just been waiting for the millennials to take over. It's like finally the millennials. They're the great hope, the great aspiration. Here come the millennials. It's all going to be better.
Oh,
I love
good.
I love the millennials. They're coming.
Thanks God the millennials.
But this is one of those cases where you're just like, actually, let's let the data guide us. And so here's an interesting data point. And this wasn't something we talked about in the podcast, but it's in some of the writing. So this notion of inequality in wealth and income, today, millennials make up about a quarter of the U.S. population. They hold just 3% of the wealth. By contrast, baby boomers at the same point held 21% of the nation's wealth. So that's the kind of deterioration we've seen in economic opportunity. And I do think that economic opportunity, that missing economic opportunity is really, really scary. I think it is. What do you think?
Well, the other question is, if this were a movie, the baby boomers would start to cough. And you go, uh-oh, something's going to happen to the baby boomers. So what happens when that wealth gets transferred? And what will the policies that we have to take advantage of that transfer, to use that transfer in productive ways, to ensure that all that wealth now gets reinvested in an effective way into our a better world? Because those baby boomers, ain't going to last forever. Now, will it flow to the millennials? I doubt it, but this is a real question about what our tax policy will be like, what all that policy stuff will be like.
Well, but maybe you just gave the outlines of the campaign that's ahead, because this was my
This was my thought.
This was my thought. I was like, so we have many global campaigns that start with C that I'm a big fan of. We've had criminal justice reform.
One of your global campaigns is to start a podcast, but go on.
Climate, great global campaign, right? So here's my question. Why can't we have a global campaign focused on corruption? Because that's one of the things that they identify. It's the corruption. It's the graft in the system. That's what's causing this erosion of confidence, because people they know it's happening and they don't like it. So why can't we have a global campaign around corruption in all of its many forms and try to systematically root it out? And why can't that be as powerful and as salient for us as any of these other campaigns where we all know and love and we point to? Because to the question I started our podcast with, do we get to do any of this work if democracy isn't working? Do you get to do it if democracy? So that's my prescription, is what is a global campaign to root out corruption so that actually governance works for everybody, irrespective of the amount of money that you can show up with to make it work for you? Why couldn't you do something like that, and whatever that would look like?
Okay, I'm in. Well, it's true. No. It's definitely true. Poor governance will drive a challenged economy, a country that doesn't function, and a larger economic system that doesn't work. But you were reminding me of my old boss, Larry Kramer, who is the mad genius over at the Hewlett Foundation, who is looking at these I would call them almost fulcrum issues. So he's looking at democracy and neoliberalism, cyber terrorism, which is one of the great threats to everything we know, and climate. And all of these things kind of go together. So you're right. If we don't have a functioning democratic system, we can't enact policies and practices that will allow us to do anything at all. And we can't pass climate policy. And if you can't pass climate policy, then all life on Earth ceases to continue the way we know it. So these pieces kind of build on each other. And Larry, a special friend of mine that he is, sees all these, how they all go together. And I'm fascinated by that level of thinking. And I just think that you are right. We have to think about anything that you care about out there right now. You have to back your way all the way back to the things that allowed those things to happen, the challenges to occur, and how do you kind of remediate or reset the system upon which all those decisions that allow your perfect world, whatever it is that you care about, whether it's health whether it's education, environment, whatever, what is all that sitting on? And I think you're right. It's faith in a democratic system, a conviction that governments and people and those kinds of decisions work and are based on a system that we all have some trust in, and on the natural systems that we all rely on to live.
Well, it is one of those
democracy. If the youths today don't have faith in democracy, we're in a world of hurt.
Yeah, it's bad times ahead, and this is one of the great things where you just get to be an idiot with a microphone, because I don't envy anybody who has to figure it out, right? I don't envy anybody who has to tease this out into the kind of levers of and interventions that can actually move the needle. But it feels so important to me. It feels so important that actually that work be done, because I think what you just said, what you called it, good governance, all of that, maybe it's not so compelling. Maybe it's hard to get people engaged. Maybe it doesn't feel like it moves the needle. But in fact, is it actually the oxygen that's in the room? Is it the thing that's actually making all this possible?
Yeah. Well, so flipping this on its head. So they say, okay, some levels of populism are ways to engage young people. But the question that I don't think they asked is, are there any other ways to engage young people that don't require these potentially polarizing positions that populism often produces? Are there any ways to be able to engage young people in the democratic process so that we are building for a better future, which don't make us run this kind of walk on this razor edge that populism often produces? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's the exact right question. In fact, I think actually it's some of the research that's ahead for their work. So I don't think they have that wrapped up in a bow. And I think even the populism effect that they described, they said it actually has a term limit, quite literally. You'll see a bounce in some cases for 1 or 2 terms, but by the time you're at the 3rd term, even that populist bump starts giving way, because those gnawing issues around, is it working or not? Is it functioning? They start taking hold. So I don't think there's a ready-made answer, frankly, at least in the research that we saw and we talked about. And I think you're right. That is the question: is how do we mobilize a kind of sustaining governance and engagement that is rooted in it? It's funny. It almost feels like an analogy to people saying, I want to develop a social media platform that doesn't feast on our worst divisions, that doesn't right, that doesn't cause us, that isn't premised on, outrage and clickability and how do I grab eyeballs. It feels like a similar question. How do we actually create a concept of engagement and civic engagement that's durable, that's rooted, that can withstand these kinds of pressures? And unfortunately, and this is back to our most recent populist horror story. Man, isn't it attractive when it's rooted in a reality TV show concept? Man, isn't it attractive? Doesn't it get people mobilized when you know how to package and frame it in a way that gets everybody all riled up? And I think this is the boring work, and so it's the harder work. How do you make this work and work well for people? But I think you've asked the perfect question. It's the exact right question.
Well, thank you, Kirk, for another stomach churning trip. Hard to say, through the underworld of our souls, from disinformation to populism. I just can't wait to see what you come up with next, Kirk. So thanks for that.
I have to say thank you to you and to the entire Let's Hear It audience, because these researchers doing this important work are saying yes to talking about it with us because they value this platform. So I have to say, nobody's talking to this this
We're
random
working that
fool.
pat on your own back, sir. But
Hey, it's
okay.
a pat on your back. It's a pat on this whole enterprise that we're developing here. But it's really fun to reach out to these researchers and have them be so willing to talk about this work, even if it challenges us. So
Okay,
thank you.
well,
It was
I
fun
feel
to do that.
challenged. Well, thanks again, Kirk, and we will see you folks next week.
And that's it for this episode. Please let us know if you have any thoughts about what you heard today, or people we should have on the show, and that includes yourself. We'd like to thank
Maggie Brown, our intrepid production coordinator.
John Ali, the tuneful and inspiring composer of our theme music.
We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Communications Network, the Lumina Foundation, and the Heinz Endowments.
Thank you. And check out the Heinz Endowment, their terrific podcast, We Can Be. That's hosted by Grant Oliphant, and you can find it at heinz.org/podcast.
We would certainly like to thank today's guest, and of course all of you, and thank you, Mr. Brown.
No, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Till next time.
Let's hear it.